Beneath the ashes of forgotten hearths and the stone bones of crumbling kitchens lies a story most have never heard, a story not of kings or wars, but of survival. Medieval survival. It wasn't written in royal chronicles or etched in cathedral glass, but preserved in the smoky beams of old smokehouses, the salt-bleached tables of long-abandoned larders, and the lingering scent of vinegar in monastery walls. Before refrigeration, before packaging, before convenience, there was ingenuity, fierce, raw, and often strange. And it all began with hunger. Imagine the winter of 1293. The frost is relentless, gnawing at the corners of wooden homes. Fields are dead. Game is scarce. There are no trucks hauling in produce from warmer regions, no grocery shelves to scour. Your survival depends entirely on what you manage to store. 6 months ago, every meal is a battle against time, against rot, against scarcity. Yet somehow, they made it work. Through methods that were at once brilliant, bizarre, and bizarrely effective. In those cold centuries, salt was power. Not a seasoning, but a lifeline. Rubbed, packed, traded, hoarded. So vital was it that Roman legions once received it as currency, the root of our modern word salary. But in medieval Europe, especially in coastal trade cities like Venice, it became something more, the foundation of an empire. Venetian salt merchants wielded control like modern tech giants, and what they sold wasn't just a commodity. It was survival in crystalline form. Meat, the most vulnerable prize, was salted until it shriveled, not in failure, but triumph. A 13th century kitchen manual advises to salt it until it looks as snow-covered, a poetic way of saying, drown it in salt until nature gives up. Pork became bacon, beef transformed into hard slabs of jerky, and even vegetables submitted to salt's dominion. Sauerkraut wasn't a German indulgence, it was microbial warfare, fermenting cabbage into a probiotic force field against winter illness. And yet, salt came with a price, often literally. A pound could cost a week's wages. In one chilling account, a French village traded its entire flock of sheep just for enough salt to last through the snow season. And so, when salt failed to pour, they turned to fire. Smoke became the great equalizer. If you stepped into a medieval kitchen, it would feel less like a culinary space and more like a ritual chamber. Dark, smoky, pungent, not out of neglect, but intention. Meat dangled like silent chimes from rafters, wrapped in the curling breath of oak, cherry, and applewood smoke. Every type of wood mattered. German cookbooks from the 1400s made fine distinctions: oak for beef, cherry for poultry, apple for pork. This was not random fumigation. It was culinary alchemy. The smoke didn't just flavor. It sealed. It hardened. It drove out bacteria with invisible fingers. It lingered in rafters for centuries, proven when archaeologists in London unearthed a smokehouse from 1375 and found its beams still faintly scented, like a whisper across time. But smoking wasn't just for meat. Cheese, grain, even eggs fell under its hazy spell. They smoked everything that couldn't flee, turning kitchens into smoky sanctuaries of edible longevity. For those with wealth and ambition, smoke alone wasn't enough. Enter the ice masters, custodians of winter itself. In the estates of the elite, great underground vaults called ice houses were carved into the earth like tombs for the sun. At Hampton Court Palace, an ice house once held 75 tons of snow, layered with sawdust like sedimentary layers of cold defiance. Some kept ice solid for 2 years. Horror folk lacked such architecture, but they improvised. Natural caves, cellars dug deep into the clay monastery, wine vaults all pressed into service as medieval refrigerators. These places, often 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, were the secret weapon of any savvy household. One can almost imagine a monk, deep in a shadowed wine cave, humming as he nestles eggs beside a barrel of ale, oblivious to the modern marvels he was unintentionally mimicking. But ice melted. Smoke dissipated. Salt ran out. And when it did, the people turned to the sun. They dried everything. Meat became leather hard. Fish pounded thin enough to crack. Grapes shriveled into raisins. They strung apples, herbs, onions across rafters like primitive chandeliers. Entire towers were built just to catch wind and light, called fruit castles in France, capable of drying over 2,000 pounds at once. These weren't quirky oddities. They were industrial-scale solutions to a problem as old as civilization: how to keep death from the pantry. Even monks recorded their drying techniques. A 14th century instruction reads, "Cut your meat as thin as patience during Lent." Another noted, if dried beef bounces, it's preserved. If it shatters, it's ruined or weaponized. Vikings, ever efficient, used dried fish as makeshift plates. Norwegian soldiers once fought a battle using jerky as shields. Exaggeration, perhaps, but the spirit of it remains. Food preservation was not just a domestic concern. It was war strategy. And yet, when air grew too moist and clouds refused to part, they turned to something more cunning: vinegar. A liquid paradox, acidic, biting, yet life-preserving. The pickling frenzy swept across Europe. Everything from turnips to pig's feet ended up submerged. Monks kept barrels of pickled vegetables so large they required ladders to stir. German texts joke about fish smelling of regret, before finally mellowing into pickled bliss. Fermentation became science and superstition intertwined. It wasn't just food, it was health. Sauerkraut kept sailors from scurvy centuries. Before vitamins had a name, one monastery kept records of over 15,000 pickled eggs in a single year. The poor monk responsible was said to dream in vinegar. Some pickled foods aged for decades. One English castle held a barrel of cabbage preserved continuously for over 40 years, refilled like a sour sacred flame. Across the channel, the Vikings preserved fish in lye, turning it into translucent jelly known as lutefisk. They considered it a delicacy. Outsiders considered it a dare. Archaeological digs in Sweden uncovered barrels of this gelatinous terror over a millennium old, still intact, still odorous, and still avoided by every living archaeologist on site. Yet not all. Fermentation reeked. Some fermented foods, sweetened with time, especially when paired with nature's other great preservative, honey. Here, preservation became poetry. Honey, which never spoils, became the amber tomb in which fruits, meats, and even whole birds were entombed. One noble recipe calls for a peacock, feathers and all, encased in honey for display. It was less a dish, more a statement of decadent defiance. Beekeepers were celebrities in their villages. Their hives were protected by law. Some were paid more than cooks. One manor recorded paying its beekeeper in silver, because without him, there would be no preserved pears, no honeyed plums, no medicinal pastes for winter wounds. Honey wasn't just sweet, it was survival. Some castles even had dedicated honey rooms, dry chambers where jars were stored like treasure. The walls, layered in decades of sticky accumulation, became unintentional traps for insects, and sometimes thieves. There's record of a thief caught by the wrist in a honey barrel and left there overnight as punishment, to test if honey was fit for preservation. Medieval cooks would drop a chicken feather into it. If it floated slowly, the honey was pure. If it sank, too watery. If it cannot hold a feather, one manuscript warns, it cannot hold your dinner. But if one wished to preserve and indulge, to combine necessity with festivity, there was always alcohol. Wine, beer, mead, they weren't just for feasts. They were liquid vaults. Fruits, herbs, and even eggs were submerged in wine and sealed away for months. Nobles preserved whole geese in red wine, creating a dish as intoxicating to taste as it was to smell. Monasteries had entire cellars for drunken plums and wine-soaked cherries, spiced with cinnamon and clove. A barrel of preserved peaches might last all winter or vanish in a single celebration. One noble house layered red and white wines in glass jars to create preserved fruit stripes. Early Instagram, centuries ahead of its time. Eggs preserved in beer were a popular tavern snack. A traveling merchant once bet he could eat 3 and ended the night singing drinking songs in Latin. He didn't speak Latin. The medieval world didn't just preserve food to survive. They preserved it to remember, to celebrate, to exert control over nature itself. Each method wasn't merely about keeping hunger at bay. It was a ritual, a mastery of time. And as we peel back the layers, one truth becomes clear. The act of preservation was also the act of resistance. Against decay, against famine, against the unknown forces that threaten to unravel the delicate thread between life and death in every dark season. Alcohol, in this world, played a dual role, sustenance and sanctum. The monasteries of Europe, those solemn bastions of faith and discipline, were not only homes to quiet prayer and illuminated manuscripts. They were also brewing laboratories, hidden behind stone walls and cloistered gardens. Monks developed techniques to ferment everything they could, not just grapes and grains, but pears, elderberries, even rose petals, all to stretch the harvest beyond the reach of spoilage. But this wasn't only about flavor. Alcohol was a microbial assassin. It killed the invisible enemies of rot and disease. In a time when no one could see germs, they sensed their behavior and wielded fermentation like a sword. The cellars of Cistercian and Benedictine monasteries were cool, dark cathedrals of survival, lined with barrels marked not with crosses, but codes for plum, apple, gooseberry, cherry, drunken fruits, soaked in wine or brandy, glimmered in ceramic jars like preserved memories. There was a mystical quality to it all, alchemic almost. Some records even describe preserved fruits offered to guests, not as food, but as tokens, sacred, storied, imbued with age. You weren't just biting into sweetness, you were consuming time itself. But these preservation strategies weren't confined to abbots and nobles. Among the peasantry, too, there was innovation, subtle, silent, born of desperation and repeated across generations until it became wisdom. Poorer households may not have had ice bunkers or barrels of wine, but they had access to ash, to clay, to sunlight and wind. Eggs, for instance, were preserved in a curious way. Some households coated them in a mixture of wood, ash, and lard, sealing their pores and locking out oxygen. Others buried them in grain bins, not for hiding, but because dry grain pulled moisture from the eggshells, allowing them to last weeks, even months. In Scandinavia, they experimented with lime water, submerging fresh eggs in a caustic bath that transformed them into ghostly orbs, eerie and preserved. We now know this as the origin of the water glassing method, later used in the early 20th century, but its roots reach far deeper. There were even accounts of people preserving milk, not as liquid, that would have been impossible, but as cheese, curds, or dried milk solids. In highland communities of France, shepherds developed techniques to dehydrate milk into hard cakes, then rehydrate them later into something resembling porridge. In essence, they were creating the medieval version of powdered milk, centuries before such a term existed. And then there's fireless cooking, an idea so simple and yet so ahead of its time. So medieval cooks, especially in wartime or famine, learned to bury clay pots filled with hot food in straw-lined boxes or deep pits, letting residual heat finish the cooking slowly over hours. The result, warm meals cooked with no flame, using insulation instead of fuel. Centuries later, this same concept would re-emerge during the World Wars under the name haybox cooking. But in truth, it was born from necessity in medieval Europe, likely forgotten and rediscovered time and again. Even water, that most basic need, required preservation. In cities and castles, rainwater was collected in cisterns, some of which still exist beneath ruins across Europe. But stagnant water was dangerous, so they infused it with herbs: rosemary, thyme, juniper, lavender, not just for flavor, but because these herbs have antibacterial properties. They didn't know why it worked, only that it did. The wisdom of survival didn't require scientific explanation. It only required observation, memory, and caution passed down like sacred text. And for every practical method, there were those that hovered on the edge of the surreal. Apples stored in straw-lined crates under beds to keep them warm in harsh winters. Cheese buried in moss, which held moisture and kept insects away. Butter submerged in brine and sealed in earthen crocks, then buried to stay cool. In some parts of medieval Ireland, bog butter was a real, strange, enduring phenomenon. Barrels of butter buried in peat bogs naturally preserved for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. Scientists have unearthed them, still intact. Their scent earthy and sour. Were they offerings? Emergency stores? No one can say for certain, but the practice is real. The butter remains. It becomes clear that preservation was never a singular act. It was layered, redundant, even ritualistic. In one village, a family might dry apples, store others in straw, pickle a third batch, and soak the rest in wine, not because they were indecisive, but because no method was perfect. The world they lived in demanded multiple solutions. Redundancy wasn't wasteful, it was sacred. It was the only insurance they had. And so food wasn't just sustenance. It became narrative. Each barrel, each string of dried plums, each honey-glazed fig, a chapter in the quiet chronicle of endurance. But not all preservation was about the practical. Some was performative, designed to display power, wealth, control over nature. At royal courts, preservation became pageantry. Feasts featured preserved oranges from Moorish Spain or lemons soaked in honey and saffron. These were not just exotic treats, but edible declarations. We are so powerful, we can eat summer in the middle of winter. This led to the rise of sugar as a preservative imported at great cost from the Middle East. Treated not as an everyday ingredient, but as a luxury and a medicine. Confectioners preserved fruits in sugar syrup, creating what they called wet sweetmeats. Later, they learned to crystallize them, turning cherries, citrus peels, even violets into candied jewels. These weren't for the masses. They were for kings, queens, and those fortunate enough to stand near them. Sugar, like salt before it, became currency. Monasteries guarded their sugar recipes as closely as their spiritual texts. Apothecaries sold preserved fruits in small doses, not as candy, but as cure. And to the medieval mind, the two were not so different. Food, after all, was healing or harm. It could poison or preserve, sustain or deceive. As sugar crept into kitchens, it brought with it the art of subtlety, elaborate dishes designed to look like something else, a roast bird disguised as a fruit that appeared to be a gemstone. It was culinary illusion, yes, but beneath the performance, the same ancient motive: to preserve, to extend life, to master time. Even in death, the principles of food preservation echoed. In some parts of medieval Europe, mourners were given preserved fruits or bread at funerals, symbolic of memory of what lingers. In times of plague, when fear over spoiled food ran parallel with terror of infection, communities turned to preservation with renewed zeal. Whole neighborhoods smoked their food, even in cities. Barrels of pickled onions lined the streets. The fear wasn't just of hunger, it was of uncertainty and the false comfort of abundance. Preservation wasn't just preparation, it was protection from the illusion that tomorrow would be safe. Somewhere in all of this, the line between science and spirit began to blur. Fermentation became folklore. Smoking became sacrament. Salt, sacred. Honey, divine. The methods survived. not just because they worked, but because they spoke to something primal in the human soul, the need to endure, to carry forward, to leave behind a legacy sealed in wax. In brine, in Ashdod, one can almost hear the whispers of a medieval cook, as she prepares her family's winter food, layering pears in honey, salting fish with deliberate reverence, drying herbs with the patience of ritual. Not because she read a book, but because her grandmother did it, and her grandmother's grandmother, and every life in between depended on it. This was the true cathedral of medieval survival, not the spire or cloister, but the cellar, not the altar, but the smokehouse, not the prayer, but the preserved plum. This was the real miracle, not divine intervention, but deliberate preservation. And so we arrive at a new understanding, that medieval food wasn't crude, it was encoded. Their kitchens weren't primitive, they were archives. Each preserved jar, a manuscript of memory. Each salted cut of meat, a footnote to a season long gone. Each honey-drenched apricot, a bookmark. Between centuries, this world is lost to us in many ways, but its wisdom remains quietly enduring in our pickles, our jams, our aged cheeses and smoked meats. In every bite of something that tastes of time, we are communing with them, the nameless cooks, brewers, fermenters, preservers, whose quiet genius carried humanity through the coldest nights, and they did it with no electricity, no machines, just fire, patience, salt, and the will to live. We have followed the salt trails, wandered through smoky rafters, crouched beside ancient ice pits and fermentation barrels. And now we arrive at the final, and perhaps most astonishing, layer of medieval preservation. The one that didn't just defy time, but attempted to control the very environment itself. Because as preservation techniques evolved, so too did the awareness of climate, geography, and architecture. The medieval mind, despite being bound by superstition and faith, was unrelentingly practical when it came to the necessities of life. And food, its survival, transformation, and protection, was the most sacred necessity of all. Across Europe, entire buildings were designed not for worship or war, but for food storage. These were not barns or pantries. They were climatic machines disguised as humble structures. In the Alps, farmers built alpine chalets with wide overhanging eaves, not for decoration, but to shield drying meats and herbs from sudden storms. In northern England, stone granaries were raised on mushroom-shaped stilts to keep rodents at bay, a design so effective it's still used in parts of the world today. The Middle Ages weren't stagnant. They adapted slowly, deliberately, but with brilliance. In Italy, underground silos were carved into the hillsides, lined with clay to store grains in total darkness and cool temperatures. In France, entire communities shared communal ovens, ice pits, and smokehouses. In the harsh winters of Scandinavia, preservation wasn't just about storage. It became synchronized, villages smoking and drying together, their survival tied, not just to technique, but to cooperation. This was preservation as infrastructure, as architecture, as community. And still, with all these tools at hand, medieval people understood that no technique could preserve food forever. At best, it was a delay, a buying of time. And so, they developed something else. Something far more profound, a rhythm. The agrarian calendar was more than just a guide for planting and harvest. It was a map for preservation. Spring meant pickling early vegetables, curing young meats. Summer meant drying in the sun, fermenting fruits. Autumn was for smoking, cellaring, salting. Winter was when these preserved foods were tested, rationed, praised, or cursed. Even feast days, holy days, and periods of fasting aligned with this rhythm. Lent, that long stretch of abstinence, conveniently coincided with the end of winter, when fresh food was scarce and people had to rely on their stores. It was a fast, yes, but also a necessity woven into doctrine. The Church, knowingly or not, helped to codify food preservation into the spiritual calendar of Europe. And this convergence of survival, ritual, and time produced something extraordinary. A culture of food not based on gluttony or constant indulgence, but reverence. Every preserved fig, every wine-soaked pear, every loaf of sour black bread pulled from a stone hearth in February was not just a meal. It was memory, history, a moment from a warmer time carried into a colder one. But this culture was not immune to darkness. With preservation came control, and with control came manipulation. The salt trade, for instance, became a tool of political power. Nobles and monarchs controlled salt routes like modern regimes control oil. The gabelle, the infamous salt tax in France, sparked outrage for centuries. Salt, once the preservative of life, became a symbol of oppression. In some regions, only the elite could afford enough salt to preserve meat for the winter. The poor were left with whatever they could ferment, smoke, or forage. Likewise, sugar, that seductive newcomer from the East, became a hallmark of colonial ambition. As Europe's hunger for sugar-preserved fruits and candies grew, so too did the demand for cane fields, labor, and ultimately the machinery of empire. The sweetened apricot on a noble's plate was, in some cases, the distant echo of a darker system unfolding far beyond medieval borders. Yet, amidst all this, the salt taxes, the hunger, the improvisation, something quietly beautiful emerge. Resilience. Take, for example, the forgotten preservation technique known as potting, a method used across the British Isles in which meat or fish was cooked, shredded, and sealed under a thick layer of fat in ceramic pots. It created an airtight seal. Today we call it confit in the French tradition. Duck preserved in its own fat, but in medieval Britain, this humble method preserved everything from rabbit to mackerel. Archaeologists have uncovered pots still sealed from the 1600s, their contents remarkably intact. One can almost imagine the hands that packed them, unaware their labor would echo through time. Or consider garum, the fermented fish sauce inherited from the Romans and still used in medieval Mediterranean cuisine. While it might repel modern sensibilities, garum was ubiquitous in noble and common kitchens alike. It was their soy sauce, their umami, their bottled complexity. Some versions took up to a year to ferment, left in sun-warmed vats of brine fish innards until it turned into a golden liquid. Once filtered, it could last indefinitely. It became one of the most prized substances in European trade, far more refined than the crude versions of later centuries. Preservation, here, created not just sustenance, but luxury. There's something haunting in the idea that food meant to last through a single winter has lasted through centuries. In peat bogs, honey tombs, and dry cellars, the remains of medieval ingenuity still survive, like messages in a bottle cast across time. What's most astonishing is how these ancient methods continue to echo in our kitchens today. Modern canning is a direct descendant of monastic sealing techniques. Root cellars are resurrected in eco-conscious homes. Fermentation, once a necessity, is now a culinary renaissance. Kombucha, kimchi, sourdough, all rediscoveries of something medieval cooks knew intimately. And yet, our era, with all its refrigeration, global supply chains, and chemical preservatives, is fragile. We've traded redundancy for convenience, preservation for perishability. We no longer live by seasons, we live by shelves. But the medieval world whispers another possibility. A slower rhythm, a deeper memory, a way of treating food not as commodity, but as inheritance. Perhaps the most profound realization is this: the act of preserving food is also the act of preserving culture. Without it, recipes vanish, seeds are lost, techniques crumble, and the knowledge that once fed entire civilizations disappears. And so we owe a quiet debt to those nameless hands, the hands that salted, smoked, buried, soaked, dried, fermented, sealed, and layered. The hands that worked not for fame, but for survival. The hands that preserved the past and, in doing so, preserved us. There is no museum that can hold what a medieval kitchen once held, no archive to contain its sounds, smells, rituals. But if you listen closely, when you taste something aged, something brine, something dried by sun or smoke, you may hear it. A whisper from the cellar, a clink of a jar, a monk humming in the shadows, a mother salting meat at dawn, a barrel in a stone vault sealed against the winter to come. Preservation was not a technique, it was a philosophy, a way of seeing time, and a promise buried in ash and honey that tomorrow would still come.